Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. They call this place the Big Thicket. It's a name that feels both grand and understated. For outsiders, it's a spot on a map of southeast Texas, a green smudge known for its swampy reputation, and a few local legends about a wild man of the woods. They have names for him, of course. Mossyback, the Saratoga Wild Man. Campfire stories meant to spook kids and sell t-shirts in the dusty gas stations on the edge of the preserve. For the handful of us who work it, who walk its trails and wade its sloughs every day, those stories are just background noise, like the whine of the mosquitoes. The real dangers are the ones you can see. Cottonmouths coiled on a low-hanging branch, a flash flood turning a dry creek bed into a torrent, or a tourist who thinks a bottle of water is enough for a 6-hour hike in August. I'm a park ranger here. For 25 years, my office has been this labyrinth of pine, cypress, and black water. At 58, I can read the land like most people read the morning paper. I know the sour smell of a storm rolling in off the Gulf, the specific rustle in the undergrowth that means feral hog instead of white-tailed deer, and the precise look in a young ranger's eyes when they're about to ask me a question I've answered 100 times before. The humidity here in July feels like a living thing. It wraps around you, seeps into your pores, makes your clothes stick to your skin like a second layer of flesh. The air shimmers with heat and moisture, creating mirages that dance just beyond your vision. Spanish moss drapes from every branch like tattered funeral shrouds, swaying in the oppressive stillness. This is a place where nature hasn't been tamed, where civilization feels like a thin veneer over something much older and more primal. The call came crackling over the radio as I was finishing my morning patrol. A missing hiker. A UT Austin kid named Vincent Torres. His rental sedan had been sitting at the Turkey Creek trailhead for 3 days now, and his family was frantic. Turkey Creek is one of the more remote units, a sprawling, boggy wilderness that can swallow a person whole if they're not careful. I drove out there with Jackson Murphy, one of the newer rangers. He was a good kid, barely 26, full of earnest energy that hadn't yet been baked out of him by the Texas sun. When we found the car, my stomach dropped. The vehicle was locked, but peering through the window revealed a wallet and smartphone sitting on the passenger seat. No experienced hiker leaves their identification and communication device behind, not willingly. We pushed into the woods, following the main trail that wound deeper into the preserve. The canopy above was so thick it blocked out most of the sun, creating a perpetual twilight that made it impossible to judge the time of day. Our boots squelched in the soft, waterlogged earth with each step. The sound echoed strangely in the oppressive quiet. Vincent's campsite was a quarter-mile in. A small dome tent of blue nylon tucked under a stand of loblolly pines. But his gear was scattered in a way that made every instinct I'd developed over 2.5 decades start screaming warnings. A pair of expensive binoculars sat on a weathered tree stump covered in morning dew. Next to them, a camera with a telephoto lens that probably cost more than my monthly salary. According to his family, Vincent was an avid birder. A birder would sooner leave his own leg behind than his optics. The tent itself was zipped shut, but when I opened it, the sleeping bag was still rolled out, though it looked like someone had thrashed around in it violently. Personal items were strewn about. A journal with pages torn out, a water bottle knocked over and still damp, energy bars scattered across the tent floor with bite marks that looked far too large to be human. We followed the trail deeper, pushing through walls of humidity that felt like walking underwater. About a mile in, we stopped dead in our tracks. The trail was completely blocked by 2 enormous water oak trees. They lay across the path in a near-perfect X formation, their massive trunks creating an impassable barrier. Jackson wiped sweat from his forehead, leaving a muddy streak across his skin. "Microburst must have hit here," he said, though his voice carried uncertainty. "Gonna take us all day to clear this." I walked the length of both trunks, examining them closely. The wood was fresh, the exposed ends pale and wet with sap. But there were no burn marks from lightning strikes, no clean cuts from a chainsaw. The breaks were splintered and raw, as if something with immense strength had simply snapped them in half. The symmetry was unsettling, too perfect to be natural, too deliberate to be coincidence. What disturbed me more was the ground around the fallen trees. The earth was churned up, as if something massive had dragged the trunks into position. Deep gouges in the mud showed where the trees had been moved, and scattered throughout the disturbed soil were impressions that made my blood freeze. Handprints, but not human handprints. These were enormous, with fingers too long and a thumb positioned too low. The palm was wider than a dinner plate, and the depth of the impressions suggested something with incredible weight had made them. We spent the rest of the day clearing the obstruction with chainsaws, our bodies drenched in sweat that attracted clouds of biting insects. By the time we finished, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees that seemed to reach toward us like grasping fingers. We found nothing else except a single hiking sock caught on a cypress knee near a stagnant pool of black water. It was bright orange, a jarring splash of color in the endless palette of green and brown. That night, I couldn't shake the image of those handprints, or the deliberate way the trees had fallen. Sleep came in fits and starts, interrupted by dreams of something massive moving through the darkness, arranging the forest to its will. Before dawn, I was back at Turkey Creek. Something was pulling me there, an instinct honed by decades in the wilderness that I'd learned never to ignore. I loaded my ATV and drove alone through the pre-dawn darkness, my headlights cutting through the thick morning fog that rose from the swamps like ghostly fingers. The forest felt different in the early morning hours. The usual symphony of awakening wildlife, the calls of red-winged blackbirds, the chittering of squirrels, the distant splash of a beaver in the bayou, was muted, subdued. Even the ever-present buzz of insects seemed quieter than normal. It was as if the entire ecosystem was holding its breath. I rode the ATV down the cleared trail, the cool morning air a welcome relief from the oppressive heat that would come with full daylight. But as I rounded the bend where we'd spent hours with the chainsaw the day before, I slammed on the brakes so hard I nearly flew over the handlebars. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. The path was blocked again. Two massive trees, different ones this time, lay across the trail in that same perfect, impossible X formation. The wood was fresh, the brakes still weeping sap. The message was clear. I was not welcome here. This was not my territory. This was a warning from something that claimed dominion over this section of the preserve. For several minutes, I just sat there on the motionless ATV, the engine ticking as it cooled. My rational mind, the one trained by 25 years of finding logical explanations for strange occurrences, scrambled for purchase and found none. This wasn't a freak weather event or vandalism. This was territorial behavior from something that possessed intelligence and incredible strength. The anger that followed was hot and sharp, cutting through my initial shock. This was my preserve. I'd walked every trail, waded through every slough, cataloged every species of plant and animal. I wouldn't be intimidated by some elaborate hoax or driven away from my responsibilities. If someone wanted to play games, I was more than ready to call their bluff. I yanked the ATV's handlebars hard to the right, veering off the established trail and into the dense undergrowth. If the main path was blocked, I'd make my own route. The machine whined and bucked as I pushed it through tangles of yaupon and sweet gum, the thick vegetation clawing at my arms and face. I was heading into one of the most remote sections of the Turkey Creek unit, where the water table was so high that solid ground was more suggestion than reality. The deeper I went, the more the landscape changed. The trees grew larger, their trunks twisted into grotesque shapes by decades of fighting for sunlight in the dense canopy. Vines as thick as my arm hung down like nooses, and the air grew thick with the smell of decay. Not the clean decomposition of autumn leaves, but something fetid and wrong, like meat left too long in the sun. Then the engine sputtered. It coughed once, belching a puff of acrid black smoke, and died. The sudden silence was deafening. I turned the key desperately, but got only a weak clicking sound in response. "No, no, no," I muttered, swinging my leg over the seat to examine the engine. The smell hit me first. Rank bog water mixed with something organic and putrid. The entire engine block was caked in thick black mud that had been deliberately packed into every crevice. It was smeared over the air intake, wound around the spark plug wires, and pressed into the cooling fins with methodical precision. This wasn't accidental submersion. This was sabotage. And there, pressed into the grime on the engine housing like a signature, was a handprint. I stared at it, my mind refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. The print was massive, the palm at least 12 inches wide. The fingers were impossibly long, and the thumb was positioned low and wide, almost like a second opposable digit. It was not the print of any human. It was not the print of any known animal. The implications crashed over me like a cold wave. Something had approached my ATV, something with the intelligence to understand mechanical systems and the strength to pack mud into precise locations that would cause maximum damage. And it had done so silently without my knowledge, while I was focused on the blocked trail. I was stranded, miles from the nearest road, in a section of the preserve where cell coverage was non-existent, and human visitors were rare. As that realization settled over me, I noticed the light beginning to fail. The sun had dipped below the tree line, and the forest was sinking into the deep, oppressive twilight that came early under the thick canopy. The silence I'd noticed earlier returned, but now it had weight to it, a presence that pressed against my eardrums. Then, from the tree line to my right, came a sound that made every hair on my body stand on end. It was a sharp crack, like a baseball bat striking an oak tree. The sound echoed through the stillness, impossibly loud in the muffled atmosphere of the swamp. I spun around, my hand instinctively moving to the service pistol holstered at my hip. I unsnapped the retention strap, though what good a handgun would do against something that could snap full-grown trees remained to be seen. My flashlight beam cut through the growing darkness, illuminating nothing but dripping leaves and twisted vines. Crack. This one came from behind me, closer, louder, then another from my left. I was being circled by something that could move through the dense undergrowth without making a sound, something that announced its presence only when it chose to. The methodical pattern was unmistakable. I was being hunted by something with intelligence and patience. A new sensation began then, something I'd never experienced in all my years in the wilderness. A low-frequency vibration that seemed to generate not in the air but in the ground beneath my feet. It traveled up through the soles of my boots, a deep, resonant hum that made my teeth ache and the fluid in my inner ears feel like it was vibrating. The sound was so low it was almost below the threshold of hearing, but I could feel it in my bones, in the pit of my stomach. The humming grew stronger, accompanied by the steady circling reports of snapping wood. Each crack was perfectly timed, perfectly positioned to keep me off balance, to remind me that escape routes were being systematically cut off. This wasn't random. This was orchestrated by something that understood fear, that knew how to use the environment as a weapon. I abandoned the ATV. There was no conscious decision, just a primal command from the oldest part of my brain. Run. I plunged into the woods, away from the circling sounds, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I crashed through the undergrowth. Branches whipped at my face, leaving stinging welts across my cheeks and forehead. Thorns tore at my uniform, and more than once I stumbled over hidden roots or cypress knees, nearly falling face first into the muck. My plan was to make it to an old logging road I knew was roughly half a mile north. If I could reach that cleared path, I'd have a straight shot back toward the main park road and civilization. The humming followed me, a constant vibration that seemed to emanate from all directions at once. I could hear movement in the brush parallel to my own desperate flight, heavy bipedal footfalls that squelched in the waterlogged soil. It wasn't rushing to overtake me. It was keeping pace, staying just at the edge of my vision, matching my speed exactly. The realization was more terrifying than any roar or growl could have been. This thing was toying with me, allowing me to run only because it chose to. I was a mouse being batted around by a cat, permitted to flee only until the game grew boring. I burst through a wall of palmetto fronds and saw the logging road ahead, a ribbon of packed earth cutting through the forest. Relief flooded through me so powerfully it nearly brought me to my knees. Salvation was 50 yards away, but as I stumbled toward it, gasping for breath, I saw what was waiting for me. A massive cypress trunk, easily 4 feet in diameter, lay directly across the road. It was fresh, the pale wood of the break still bleeding sap. The ground around it was torn up, showing clear evidence that the tree had been dragged into position. My escape route had been anticipated and blocked. Every path I might take had been considered and eliminated by something that thought several moves ahead. The methodical intelligence behind the obstruction was more frightening than any display of brute strength could have been. This wasn't an animal acting on instinct. This was something that could predict human behavior, that understood tactics and strategy. And it had been hurting me, guiding my panicked flight toward this dead end with the patience of a chess master moving pieces across a board. I pressed my back against a massive cypress trunk, trying to control my breathing, which was coming in ragged, painful gasps. Every shadow seemed to move. Every hanging vine looked like a reaching arm. The low-frequency humming had stopped, leaving a silence so complete it felt solid, like a wall pressing against my eardrums. Then I heard something that chilled me more than any roar could have. It was the call of a barred owl. The familiar "who cooks for you" that I'd heard thousands of times in my career. But this call was wrong. Too deep, too resonant, produced in a chest cavity far too large for any bird. It was a perfect mimicry, but with an undertone that spoke of intelligence and mockery. It was telling me that it knew the sounds of this place, that it could replicate them, and that it owned them. The call came again, closer this time, and I realized with dawning horror that it was moving. Not flying, but walking. The sound source traveling horizontally through the trees at a height that would require something at least 8 feet tall. My flashlight beam trembled as I swept it across the canopy, but the thick foliage revealed nothing. I had to move. Staying put would mean inevitable discovery. I slipped down the muddy bank into the black water of a narrow bayou, the liquid so dark it might as well have been motor oil. The cold was a violent shock to my overheated system, and the bottom was soft, treacherous muck that tried to trap my boots with every step. The water came up to my chest, and I could feel things moving in it. Fish, snakes, or worse. Halfway across, the humming returned, transmitted through the water itself, so that it surrounded me completely. I could feel it vibrating in my chest cavity, disrupting my heartbeat. It was then that I made the mistake of looking back at the bank I'd just left. Standing there, motionless as a statue, was a shape that violated every natural law I'd ever known. It was colossal, at least 9 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they seemed to span the space between 2 trees. The proportions were wrong. Too massive for any living thing, yet somehow perfectly balanced. It stood on 2 legs, perfectly still, its head tilted slightly as if studying me with the detached interest of a scientist examining a specimen. What struck me most was its absolute stillness. It didn't sway or shift its weight like a living creature would. It was a pillar of darkness carved out of the night itself. A void in the shape of something that should not exist. And it was watching me with an intelligence that was ancient, patient, and utterly inhuman. I scrambled up the opposite bank, my clothes heavy with swamp water, and ran blindly into the forest. Behind me, I heard no pursuit, no crashing through the undergrowth. Just that terrible, oppressive silence. When I finally emerged onto a fire road an hour later, collapsing from exhaustion and terror, I knew with absolute certainty that I hadn't escaped. I'd been released. The thing in the big thicket had examined me, weighed me, and found me unworthy of further attention. My survival wasn't a victory, it was indifference. And that knowledge, the understanding that my life had hung in the balance of something so powerful yet so dismissive, was a horror that would follow me for the rest of my days. The preserve continued to operate normally. Tourists came and went. Other rangers walked the same trails I'd fled down in terror. But I knew the truth. Something ancient lived in the deep places of the big thicket. Something that remembered when this land was wild and untamed. And God help anyone who ventured too far into its domain, unprepared for what they might find waiting in the darkness between the trees. Vincent Torres was never found. His case remains open, another unsolved disappearance in a place where the line between civilization and wilderness grows thinner with each passing year. Sometimes, late at night, when the humidity is thick and the Spanish moss hangs like grave shrouds from the ancient trees, I wonder if he discovered the same terrible truth I did. And I pray to God that he was granted the same indifferent mercy that allowed me to walk out of those woods alive. Red River Gorge had always been our family's favorite escape. Growing up in Lexington, my brother Jordan and I spent countless weekends camping there, racing down muddy trails and trying our luck fishing the twisting creeks. But it had been years since either of us made time for an extended trip. Work, life, and everything else had gotten in the way. This time was different, though. We needed it. Especially Jordan. His recent breakup had left him hollow-eyed and withdrawn. I figured a weekend fishing deep in the quiet of Clifty Wilderness would clear both our minds. I'd found an old Forest Service map with a promising, isolated fishing spot marked on Swift Camp Creek. It wasn't near any official trails, but that was part of the appeal. The isolation would give us time to reconnect, away from cell towers and the constant buzz of modern life. We set out early from Coomer Ridge Trailhead on a Friday morning in October 2022. The air was damp, still cool from morning fog that clung to the hollows like cotton. Jordan was in good spirits for the first time in weeks, cracking jokes and recounting stories from our childhood as we walked deeper into the forest. The familiar landmarks disappeared behind us as we veered off the main trail, pushing through dense rhododendron thickets and across narrow deer paths barely visible beneath fallen leaves. The forest changed as we went deeper. Tourist trails gave way to true wilderness, where massive hemlocks blocked out the sun and the undergrowth grew thick and tangled. After 3 hours of steady hiking, the map indicated we were close. The faint roar of distant water confirmed our approach, growing louder with each step through the dense vegetation. Then we saw it. A massive fallen oak spanning a narrow ravine about 20 feet across. The ravine walls were steep, nearly vertical in places, the bottom tangled with thick mountain laurel and dead branches bleached white by time. The log looked ancient but sturdy, wedged neatly between the banks as though carefully positioned there by design rather than chance. Jordan didn't hesitate. He swung his heavy backpack onto his shoulders and walked right across, arms slightly outstretched for balance. His boots made hollow sounds against the bark. I paused at the edge, eyeing the drop below. It was deeper than it first appeared, maybe 30 feet to the bottom, where shadows pooled thick and dark. I followed carefully, keeping my gaze locked firmly ahead on Jordan's back. The log was wider than expected, easily 2 feet across, but the bark was slick with moss. Halfway across, I felt Jordan stop abruptly in front of me. I glanced up, nearly stumbling into him. He was frozen, staring down into the ravine with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. Pure, unfiltered shock. "What?" I whispered sharply, pulse quickening as I adjusted my balance. the log suddenly felt narrower, less stable. Jordan didn't answer immediately. His eyes were wide, locked on something below. His knuckles were white where he gripped his walking stick. Finally, without moving his head, he said quietly, "Did you see that?" I followed his gaze but saw nothing, just shadows tangled among dense bushes and branches. The ravine bottom was a maze of vegetation and fallen timber. "See what?" "A man," Jordan muttered, his voice unsteady. "Barefoot. He was down there, staring right up at us." My heart sped up, the thought deeply unsettling. We were miles from any trail, further still from any road. "Where?" He pointed toward a dense patch directly below the midpoint of the log. My eyes scanned again, adjusting to the shadows. The forest below was still, empty. There was no movement, no sound except our own breathing and the distant creek. Nothing that suggested human presence. "Are you sure?" "Positive." Jordan finally moved forward, swiftly crossing to the other side. I joined him quickly, stepping onto solid ground with profound relief. Without speaking, we dropped our packs and scrambled carefully down the slope, pushing branches aside, searching. The descent was treacherous, loose soil giving way beneath our boots. I felt an inexplicable dread as we reached the bottom. Nothing. No tracks in the soft earth, no disturbed brush, no broken twigs or bent grass. No evidence anyone had ever stood there. The spot where Jordan had pointed was undisturbed, the leaf litter intact. I looked at Jordan, whose face had turned pale beneath his week-old beard. He shook his head slowly, clearly shaken. I swear to God, man, he was looking right at us. He was wrong somehow, the way he stood. The feeling was deeply uncomfortable, but daylight was still strong and rational explanations were easy enough to find. "Maybe just shadows playing tricks," I offered weakly, trying to ease the tension. "The light down here, the way it filters through." Jordan didn't respond, just nodded slowly, unconvinced. We climbed back out, muscles burning from the steep ascent, and continued hiking. Neither of us talked much. The easy camaraderie from the morning had evaporated. Soon we reached our destination, a wide, shallow bend in Swift Camp Creek where the water ran clear over smooth limestone. The spot was perfect, exactly as the old map had promised. A flat area suitable for tents sat back from the water, protected by towering sycamores. After setting up camp with practiced efficiency, I organized the fishing gear while Jordan got a fire going. The familiar routines helped, but the silence between us was uneasy at first. As we settled in, the atmosphere slowly returned to something approaching normal. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling we weren't alone. Every snapping twig in the forest made me turn. I was organizing tackle when I noticed something strange. The brass clasp on my tackle box hung loose. I distinctly remembered locking it earlier. I always did. A habit drilled into me by our grandfather. The contents seemed undisturbed, but the open clasp bothered me. Glancing toward Jordan, who seemed absorbed in tending the fire, I decided not to mention it. As darkness gathered around us, the comforting crackle of the fire and the familiar murmur of the creek eased my tension. We caught several smallmouth bass, cleaning them by firelight and cooking them over the coals. The simple meal tasted better than anything I'd eaten in months. Eventually we relaxed, trading old stories again, laughing about past camping disasters until exhaustion set in. Crawling into my tent, I pushed away lingering anxiety. But even as I lay there, eyes heavy, I couldn't escape the image of that empty ravine. No matter how I rationalized, it felt as if something had begun out there, something quietly watching us from the shadows beneath the log. Sleep came slowly, unevenly. I drifted in and out, tangled in my sleeping bag, restless from the day's strange encounter. The night sounds of the forest, owls calling, small animals rustling through leaves, kept jerking me awake. Eventually, though, exhaustion won out. I fell into a shallow, dreamless sleep. I woke to complete darkness. Something had changed. The normal night sounds had stopped entirely. No insects, no wind. Even the creek seemed muted. I lay perfectly still, straining to understand what had woken me. Then I heard it. A quiet, shuffling noise from across the water. Not an animal. The rhythm was wrong, too deliberate. Human footsteps on wet stones. I held my breath, straining to catch it again. Silence returned, heavy and oppressive, lasting so long I began to doubt myself. Then a soft voice drifted across the creek, carried on the still air. A whisper, unmistakably clear. "Brother." I sat up quickly, heart hammering against my ribs. The voice had been mine. My exact tone, my inflection, but coming from across the water. Beside me, Jordan slept heavily, breathing slow and steady. I nudged him urgently. "Jordan, wake up!" I hissed, my voice low but tight with fear. He stirred sluggishly, eyes barely opening. "What?" he murmured, half asleep. "There's somebody outside," I whispered sharply, eyes fixed on the tent door. "Across the creek. Listen." Jordan paused, waiting in sleepy silence. Moments passed. Nothing. The creek murmured. A distant barred owl called. Normal sounds returning. "Probably just animals, man," Jordan finally muttered, irritated. He rolled onto his side, pulling his sleeping bag higher. "Go back to sleep." Frustration bubbled up inside me, but I said nothing more. I sat rigid, listening as minutes dragged by like hours. Just as I started convincing myself it had been my imagination, the voice returned, clear and measured, carrying through the darkness again. "Jordan!" My pulse raced as I recognized the voice. My voice again, but wrong. Like a recording played back at the wrong speed. Jordan shifted uncomfortably now, eyes wide open in the darkness. "What was that?" he whispered, now fully awake. His hand moved slowly toward the knife beside his sleeping bag. "That's what I heard earlier," I replied quietly. It called me brother first, in my voice. Jordan pushed himself upright, suddenly alert. "Is someone messing with us?" His voice shook slightly as he moved slowly toward the zipper of the tent door. "Wait," I whispered urgently, reaching out to stop him. "Just listen." We stayed still, hearts thudding in the silence. The darkness outside seemed to press against the thin tent walls. Minutes passed. Then, horrifyingly close to our tent, we heard breathing. Slow, deliberate breathing, as if someone was standing just inches from the nylon wall, listening to us, listening to them. We didn't sleep again. We sat back to back in the tent, knives in hand, waiting for dawn. Every small sound sent adrenaline surging through our bodies. Twice more we heard the footsteps circling our camp, sometimes stopping for long minutes just outside. We never heard them leave. Dawn finally broke after what felt like an eternity. Pale morning light brought courage enough to exit the tent. We emerged slowly, cautiously, scanning the campsite. Everything appeared normal at first glance. Our gear where we'd left it. The cold fire ring. The creek running clear and peaceful. Then Jordan's voice broke through sharply. "Hey, look at this." I turned. He was standing beside the fire ring, staring down with a mixture of confusion and fear. I joined him quickly, dread pooling in my stomach. Our fire, which we'd carefully banked and covered last night, was completely gone. Not just out, gone. The ashes, the half-burned logs, even the stones we'd arranged in a circle. The ground was swept clean. "What the hell?" Jordan said quietly, anger masking his obvious fear. But that wasn't all. The rope we'd hung between two trees to dry our wet socks had been cut, not untied, but cleanly severed. The ends hung loose, swaying in the morning breeze. The socks were gone. A few feet further away, I spotted something even stranger. One of my boots lay upside down in the dirt, about 20 feet from our tent. I knew I'd left both boots inside the tent vestibule. I picked it up, noticing immediately the soft earth beside it. Pressed deep into the mud was the clear imprint of bare toes, the arch of a foot. The prints led away toward the creek, then simply stopped at the water's edge. "We need to leave," I said firmly, my voice steady but tight. "Now." Jordan nodded without argument. We quickly packed our gear, not bothering with breakfast, constantly glancing over our shoulders at the quiet woods. Everything felt wrong. The morning birds that should have been singing were silent. Even the creek seemed to murmur warnings. We retraced our steps through the dense undergrowth, moving at a pace just short of running. Neither of us spoke as we approached the ravine, desperate to put distance between ourselves and whatever had found us in the night. The morning was brighter now, reassuringly normal, sunlight filtering through the canopy in golden streams. Then we reached the edge of the ravine and froze. The fallen log we'd crossed only yesterday afternoon was gone. Not shifted or broken, completely vanished. The gap yawned before us, impossible to cross without climbing gear we didn't have. Both banks showed no sign a massive oak had ever bridged them. My chest tightened, panic rising like bile. Jordan looked as shaken as I felt, pacing frantically along the edge. "It was here, right here," he insisted, voice rising toward hysteria. "This is the spot. Look, there's the blazed tree we noted." I glanced down at the soft earth where the log should have rested, searching for any sign it had ever existed. There was nothing. No bark fragments, no depression in the earth, not even disturbed leaves. The ground was covered in undisturbed leaf litter that looked weeks old. Then my eyes landed on something that turned my stomach. Near the edge, fresh in the morning dew, were bare footprints pressed deeply into the damp soil. They circled the area where we stood, as if someone had walked rounds while we searched. Beyond them, partially hidden by ferns, was another set of tracks, worn boot prints that led away from the ravine into a dense cluster of mountain laurel. Jordan's breathing grew rapid, borderline hyperventilating. He pointed toward the brush with a shaking hand. "Someone's watching us. They've been following us since yesterday. They moved the log. They trapped us here." I didn't respond. There was nothing rational to say. I simply tightened my backpack straps, fighting back the terror clawing at my chest, and turned away from the gap. We followed the edge of the ravine, searching for another crossing point, finding nothing but sheer drops and dense tangles of rhododendron. Hours passed in desperate hiking. We were lost now, truly lost, moving by instinct alone. The forest had become a maze. Landmarks that should have been there weren't. Trails we thought we recognized led nowhere. The sun, which should have guided us west, seemed to move erratically through the canopy. By late afternoon, exhaustion forced us to stop. We'd broken through endless thickets and emerged into a small clearing surrounded by ancient hemlocks. There was no clear path forward in any direction. The forest pressed in on all sides, dark and impossibly dense. Jordan dropped his backpack heavily, frustration and fear plain on his face. "We'll never make it out tonight," he said bitterly. "We're going in circles." I knew he was right, but dread filled me at the thought of spending another night in this place. The things that had stalked us last night would find us again. But we had no choice. Reluctantly, we agreed to set up camp where we stood, hidden among tall ferns and twisted saplings. We didn't speak as we set up the tent with shaking hands. There was no fire this time. We didn't want to advertise our location. We sat silently in the gathering darkness, eating cold energy bars, knives resting across our laps, taking turns watching while the other tried to rest. Night fell like a physical weight, the darkness absolute under the heavy canopy. Neither of us even pretended to sleep. We sat upright, alert, straining to hear over our own thundering heartbeats. Every sound was magnified. Every shadow could hide watching eyes. Time became meaningless. Then, sometime in the deepest part of night, we heard footsteps approaching the tent. Slow, deliberate, circling, getting closer with each pass. I reached silently for my knife, gripping it so tightly my knuckles ached. Jordan sat frozen beside me. The footsteps stopped directly beside our tent. We could hear breathing again, slow and patient. Then the zipper moved, just an inch. Testing. Jordan lunged forward, grabbing his knife, eyes wild with terror. I reacted instinctively, gripping the zipper from inside and tearing it downward in one violent motion, ready to confront whatever waited outside. Nothing. Empty darkness. I stepped out cautiously, flashlight and knife extended, scanning rapidly. The clearing was deserted. But the soft earth revealed the truth. Fresh footprints circled our tent repeatedly. Bare feet had walked around and around, sometimes stopping to stand in one spot for long periods, facing the tent. We're leaving. Now, Jordan said harshly, already stuffing gear into his pack with shaking hands. I don't care if we have to walk all night. We abandoned half our equipment, taking only essentials. Using our flashlights despite the risk, we crashed through the undergrowth. Direction didn't matter anymore. We just needed to move, to find any sign of civilization. After an hour of desperate bushwhacking, we stumbled onto a deer trail. It led upward, and we followed it blindly, hoping elevation would lead us to a road. The trail ended at a dirt embankment. Above us, impossibly welcome, was the dark stripe of asphalt, Tunnel Ridge Road. But between us and salvation was a rusted drainage pipe, its mouth yawning beneath the road. Fresh boot prints led directly inside, disappearing into absolute darkness. The bare footprints followed, overlapping the boots. Jordan stopped beside me, staring in disbelief. We can't go through there. From somewhere deep in the pipe came a wet sound, like something large shifting in water. A whisper echoed out, distorted by the metal walls, but unmistakably familiar. It was my voice again, but speaking words I'd never said. Come home, brother. We backed away and found another route up the embankment, scrambling up loose soil and roots. We reached the road just as true dawn broke. The first vehicle we saw was a Forest Service truck. We flagged it down desperately, probably looking like madmen. The ranger who stopped was an older man with kind eyes that turned serious as we babbled out our story. When we finally ran out of words, he was quiet for a long moment. "You boys came from Swift Camp Creek?" he asked. We nodded. "And you crossed on a fallen log that's not there anymore?" "Yes," I said, surprised he seemed to believe us. He sighed deeply. "You're not the first. Won't be the last, I expect. That crossing, it's been reported before. Always the same. Someone crosses going in. The log's gone when they try to leave." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "We've had people go missing out there. Some for days. Some longer." He drove us back to our cars at the trailhead, but insisted on one detour. He wanted to see the drainage pipe. In daylight it looked ordinary, rusty and forgotten. But when I looked closer at the corroded metal, I saw them, names scratched into the rust. Dozens of them. Some old and barely legible, others fresh. My blood went cold when I found it. There, carved with horrible clarity into the metal, was my name. But I'd never written it. And below it, fresher still, was Jordan's. The ranger put a firm hand on my shoulder, guiding me back to the truck. "Some places," he said quietly, "they mark you, remember you, wait for you to come back." We drove home in silence. We've never returned to Red River Gorge, but sometimes on quiet nights, I wake to the sound of my own voice calling from the darkness outside my window. "Come home, brother. Come home." I never answer. I never will. But I know that somewhere in those ancient hills, something is still waiting by a ravine that sometimes has a bridge and sometimes doesn't, waiting for us to cross back over. The murky waters of the Atchafalaya swamp have always held secrets. Secrets that whisper through the Spanish moss and lurk beneath the surface of stagnant pools. But none so terrifying as the one I'm about to share. My name's Remy, born and raised near these treacherous wetlands, and I'm here to tell you about the night that changed everything. The night I learned that some legends are best left untold. It was late October, that time of year when the swamp transitions from suffocating heat to a bone-deep chill that seeps into your marrow. Me, my cousin Beau, and our old friend Etienne had been planning this hunting trip for months. Etienne had tracked a monster buck, a ghost of a deer that had eluded hunters for seasons. This was our chance at legend. We set out before dawn, Etienne's battered airboat cutting through the pre-morning stillness. The fog was thick, tendrils of mist coiling around us like spectral fingers. I tried to shake off the unease, cracking jokes about swamp monsters to lighten the mood. But there was an electricity in the air, a tension that set my teeth on edge. "Y'all feel that?" Beau muttered, his eyes darting nervously across the misty expanse. Etienne just grunted, his weathered face set in grim determination. "Old magic stirring," he said, his Cajun accent thicker than usual. "Best keep your wits about you, Cher." I laughed it off, but a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. Hours passed as we pushed deeper into the swamp than I'd ever been before. The trees grew denser, their gnarled branches forming a canopy that seemed to swallow what little light managed to penetrate the fog. By the time we reached Cypress Hammock, Etienne's chosen hunting ground, the world had narrowed to shades of gray and murky green. The island was barely more than a raised patch of ground, choked with vegetation and surrounded by black water. As we stepped off the boat, the mud sucked at our boots, threatening to pull us down into its depths. The air was thick with the smell of decay and something else, something wild and musky that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Spread out," Etienne whispered, his eyes scanning the tree line. "But stay within earshot. This ain't no place to get lost." We fanned out, moving as quietly as we could through the underbrush. Every step was a challenge. Rotting logs gave way underfoot, hidden roots threatened to trip us, and more than once I caught sight of a water moccasin slithering away from my approach. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional buzz of an insect or the distant splash of something entering the water. Hours crawled by with no sign of our prized buck. The heat built steadily, turning the air into a stifling blanket that clung to our skin. Sweat poured down my face, stinging my eyes and attracting clouds of mosquitoes. By the time we regrouped for a water break, even Etienne looked discouraged. "Maybe that buck ain't so dumb after all," I said, trying to lighten the mood. But my voice sounded hollow, swallowed up by the swamp's vastness. That's when we heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, too deep for a gator, too guttural for a bear. The sound reverberated through my chest, setting my heart racing. I looked at Beau and Etienne, seeing my own fear reflected in their eyes. Etienne's face had gone ashen, his lips moving in a silent prayer. "Dogman," he whispered, the word barely audible but carrying the weight of generations of hushed stories and dire warnings. Growing up in Louisiana, you hear all sorts of tales. Stories of rougarou, swamp lights, and things that go bump in the bayou night. But the legend of the Dogman was different. It wasn't just a boogeyman to scare kids straight. It was spoken of in hushed tones by hardened hunters, by men who'd stared down gators and come out on top. The Dogman was something else entirely. A nightmare given flesh, with eyes that glowed like hellfire and jaws that could snap a man in two. I'd always laughed off those stories, chalked them up to too much moonshine and overactive imaginations. Standing there in that godforsaken swamp, with that inhuman growl still echoing in my ears, I'd never felt so foolish in my life. "We need to go," Beau said, his voice tight with panic. "Now." But Etienne held up a hand, his eyes scanning the tree line. "Slow," he cautioned. "No sudden moves. It ain't fully on the hunt yet." We began to back away, every step measured and careful. The undergrowth seemed to close in around us, branches clawing at our clothes as if trying to hold us in place. The growl came again, closer this time. My hands shook as I gripped my rifle, knowing deep down that it would be useless against whatever was out there. Etienne muttered under his breath, a stream of words I couldn't quite make out. It sounded like a prayer, or maybe a spell, some old Cajun magic passed down through the generations. "We need silver," he said suddenly, his eyes wild. "Regular bullets won't do shit against a dogman." I wanted to laugh to tell him he'd lost his damn mind. But Beau was nodding, his face set in grim determination. "Grandpappy's old revolver," he said, "back at the boat, if we can just—" His words were cut off by an explosion of movement from the trees ahead. Something massive burst through the undergrowth, all matted fur and yellow eyes and teeth like daggers. In that moment, my world narrowed to a pinprick of terror. The dogman was real, and it was hungry. What happened next is a blur of panic and primal fear. The creature, I can't bring myself to call it an animal, it was too aware, lunged towards us with impossible speed. Beau, who had somehow gotten separated from Etienne and me, let out a scream that turned my blood to ice. I caught only flashes as I stumbled backward. Massive, hulking form, easily 7 feet tall when it reared up. Fur matted with mud and what looked horribly like dried blood. But it was the eyes that haunted me. Yellow, glowing with an intelligence that had no place in a beast. They fixed on Beau with a hunger that made my stomach lurch. "Run!" Etienne bellowed, already scrambling away. "For the love of God, run!" I didn't need to be told twice. Survival instinct kicked in, overriding everything else. I turned and fled, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. Behind me, I heard Beau scream again, a sound of pure agony that cut off with a wet, gurgling noise. The swamp became a nightmare landscape. Every tree looked the same, every path circling back on itself. The dogman's roars echoed through the fog, sometimes seeming to come from all directions at once. My lungs burned, legs trembling with exhaustion, but terror kept me moving. I lost sight of Etienne in the chaos. Part of me hoped he'd made it to the boat, that he was already starting the engine. But a darker voice whispered that I was alone now. Nothing between me and the monster but dumb luck and fading stamina. Time lost all meaning. I ran until I couldn't anymore. Then I crawled, pulled myself through the muck on hands and knees. The swamp itself seemed alive, vines tangling around my ankles, shadows reaching out with grasping fingers. When I finally broke through to the clearing where we'd left the airboat, the sun was already dipping below the horizon. Etienne was there, bleeding from a dozen cuts, his eyes wild with fear. We didn't speak. No words could encompass the horror we'd just lived through. We just fired up the engine and tore out of there. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, clinging to us until we hit open water. The days that followed were a haze of disbelief and bureaucratic nightmare. We told our story, or at least the parts we could bear to relive, to the sheriff, to park rangers, to anyone who would listen. A search party was organized, combing the area where we'd last seen Beau. They found nothing. No body, no blood, not so much as a scrap of clothing. The official report chalked it up to a tragic accident. Gator attack, they said. Or maybe Beau had fallen, hit his head, been swept away by the current. The unspoken implication hung in the air that we'd been drinking, gotten spooked by shadows and swamp gas. Beau's family got their polite condolences, and the world moved on. But Etienne and I, we couldn't let it go. The memory of those eyes, that hunger, it haunted us. Etienne threw himself into research, digging through parish records, old texts, anything he could get his hands on. And slowly, a pattern emerged. Disappearances stretching back decades, maybe centuries. Mangled remains found on the outskirts of towns. Hunters' tales dismissed as drunken ramblings. All of it pointing to something ancient and terrible lurking in the depths of the swamp. The town split into factions. Those who already half believed the old stories nodded knowingly, brought us casseroles, and muttered prayers of protection. The rest looked at us with pity or barely concealed contempt. My regulars at the bar where I worked avoided the subject, an awkward silence falling whenever I entered the room. I couldn't blame them. Life's hard enough in those parts without inviting talk of monsters. But I couldn't go back to normal. Couldn't pretend that thing wasn't out there. The guilt ate at me. Guilt over Beau. Guilt over every story I'd laughed off, every warning I'd ignored. Etienne felt it too. We spent our nights poring over his research, arguing about protection spells and silver bullets. It was a fool's errand, we both knew it. But the alternative, doing nothing, was unthinkable. 2 weeks after that fateful hunt, Etienne and I found ourselves back in the swamp. The plan, if you could call it that, was desperate at best. Etienne had blessed a batch of silver ammunition. We'd even melted down his grandmother's heirloom candlesticks in our fervor. We'd lie in wait at Cypress Hammock, not as prey this time, but as hunters. The journey back was tense, every splash and rustle setting our nerves on edge. We set up in an old hunting blind overlooking a stretch of murky water choked with lily pads. The day crawled by, hours blending together in a haze of insect bites and suffocating humidity. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of blood and bruise, doubt began to creep in. Had we imagined it all? Was grief playing tricks on our minds? But then the smell hit us. Rotting meat and musk, so potent it made my eyes water. It emerged from the gathering gloom like a nightmare-given form. Massive, muscled, moving with a fluid grace that belied its size. Those eyes, God, those eyes. They fixed on us with a terrible intelligence, burning with hunger and something that might have been amusement. Etienne's hands shook as he fumbled with the blessed shells. I raised my rifle, took a deep breath, and squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, shattering the swamp's eerie silence. The creature roared, a sound that shook the entire cypress stand. Birds exploded from the canopy, their panicked cries adding to the cacophony. But the dogman didn't fall. It staggered, snarled, then began to circle us with predatory focus. We fired again and again, the blessed silver shells leaving smoking wounds in the creature's hide. But it kept coming. Relentless. Unstoppable. In that moment, I realized the terrible truth. Our weapons, our plans. They were little more than a child's toys against this ancient evil. The blind splintered under the dogman's assault. I was thrown backward, blinding pain lancing through my side as claws raked across my ribs. My rifle was lost in the chaos, leaving me defenseless. Etienne's voice cut through the madness, shouting something in Old Cajun that I could barely understand. He hurled himself at the creature, the last of our silver ammunition gleaming in the fading light. Shots rang out, and for a moment, hope flared in my chest. But then the dogman moved, faster than anything that size had any right to move. It snatched Etienne up in one massive paw, those terrible jaws closing around his throat. I'll never forget the sound, the wet crunch of bone. Etienne's choked scream cut horribly short. The last thing I remember is a searing pain in my head and the world tilting sideways into darkness. I woke up in the hospital 2 days later, my body a mass of stitches and half-healed wounds. The doctors spoke of infection, of fever dreams, their faces kind but disbelieving as I babbled about the monster in the swamp. They released me eventually, back into a world that had already begun to forget. The town treated me differently. Sideways glances, hushed conversations that stopped when I entered a room. I lost my job at the bar. No one wants a half-crippled bartender who jumps at shadows. These days, I spend most of my time on the porch of my rundown trailer, watching the swamp mist roll in and wondering who will be next. Because that's the truth that haunts me, the knowledge that keeps me awake at night. The dogman is still out there. I hear the whispers. Livestock gone missing, half-eaten remains found at the edge of people's property. And sometimes when the wind is right, I swear I can smell that rotten musk drifting on the breeze. Those yellow eyes are out there in the darkness, watching, waiting. And sooner or later, they'll come for us all. It was supposed to be a simple getaway, a chance to clear my head and escape the suffocating grip of city life. My name is Marcus Thorne, and I've always considered myself an outdoorsman at heart. Growing up in the suburbs of Chicago, I'd spend every chance I got exploring the nearby forest preserves, imagining myself as some intrepid explorer charting unknown wilderness. But life, as it often does, had other plans for me. A decade of corporate drudgery, a messy divorce, and the recent loss of my father had left me feeling hollow, disconnected from the world and from myself. That's why, when I finally managed to take a leave of absence from work, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I rented an RV, packed my gear, and set out for the Appalachian Mountains. My destination, a remote campground called Shadowbrook, nestled deep in the heart of what locals referred to as the Whispering Woods. The drive was long but therapeutic. As I left the sprawling urban landscape behind, I felt the weight on my shoulders gradually lifting. The further I got from civilization, the more alive I felt. By the time I reached the outskirts of the Whispering Woods, a sense of anticipation had replaced my usual anxiety. The forest was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Ancient trees towered overhead, their gnarled branches reaching out like grasping fingers. The canopy was so thick that even in the middle of the day, the forest floor was bathed in an eerie twilight. As I navigated the narrow, winding road to the campground, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I chalked it up to my imagination, excited by the prospect of adventure. Shadowbrook Campground turned out to be little more than a small clearing with a few primitive campsites. It was perfect. I was the only one there, which suited me just fine. I parked my RV near a babbling brook that gave the campground its name and set about making camp. As I worked, I felt a rare sense of peace wash over me. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the earthy scent of decaying leaves and pine. The gentle gurgle of the brook mixed with the rustling of leaves in the breeze, creating a soothing, natural symphony. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. With camp set up, I decided to explore a bit before nightfall. I grabbed my backpack, made sure my GPS was working, and set off into the woods. The trail was overgrown and barely visible in places, but I wasn't worried. I had always prided myself on my sense of direction. As I hiked deeper into the forest, the atmosphere began to change. The trees seemed to press in closer, their branches intertwining overhead to block out what little light filtered through. The air grew thick and heavy, almost oppressive. And the silence, it was absolute. No bird calls, no scurrying animals, not even the buzz of insects. Just an all-encompassing quiet that seemed to swallow every sound. I was about to turn back when I spotted something through the trees, a flash of weathered wood that didn't belong. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pushed through the underbrush toward it. What I found made my breath catch in my throat. It was an old cabin, long abandoned and half reclaimed by the forest. Vines crawled up its walls, and part of the roof had caved in. But there was something about it that drew me in, a sense of forgotten history that called to be discovered. Approaching cautiously, I peered through one of the grimy windows. The interior was dark, filled with shadows and decay. But there, on a rickety table in what must have been the main room, was a stack of old photographs. They seemed so out of place in the dereliction that I couldn't resist taking a closer look. I tried the door, half expecting it to be locked, but it swung open with a mournful creak. The musty smell of abandonment assaulted my nostrils as I stepped inside. Dust motes danced in the few beams of light that managed to penetrate the gloom. I made my way to the table, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. The photographs were old, their edges yellowed and curling. They showed a family, a man, a woman, and 2 children. Their faces were solemn, their eyes holding a sadness that seemed to transcend time. As I flipped through the images, a chill ran down my spine. In each successive photo, the family looked more gaunt, more haunted. And in the final image, only the man remained, his eyes wild and unfocused, staring at something beyond the camera. A floorboard creaked behind me, and I spun around, my heart racing. But there was nothing there, just empty shadows and dust. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was time to leave. As I hurried back to my campsite, the forest seemed different. Shadows danced at the corner of my vision, always disappearing when I turned to look. The trees loomed larger, their branches reaching out like clawed hands, and all the while that oppressive silence pressed in on me, broken only by the pounding of my own heart. By the time I reached my RV, the sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of blood red and deep purple. I quickly started a fire, its warm glow providing a small circle of comfort in the gathering darkness. As I prepared my dinner, I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. It was just an abandoned cabin, I told myself. Old photos of a family long gone. Nothing to be afraid of. But as night fell and the forest came alive with unfamiliar sounds, I found it hard to believe my own reassurances. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush set my nerves on edge. I retreated to the relative safety of my RV, locked the doors, and tried to sleep. Sleep, when it came, was fitful and filled with unsettling dreams. I saw the family from the photographs, their hollow eyes accusing as they reached out to me with skeletal hands. I dreamt of running through endless woods, always pursued by something I couldn't see but could feel breathing down my neck. I woke with a start sometime after midnight, my shirt soaked with sweat. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was. Then it all came flooding back. The woods, the cabin, the photos. And that's when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching on the gravel outside my RV. They circled the vehicle, pausing occasionally as if listening. My mouth went dry and my heart hammered against my ribs. "Hello?" I called out, hating how weak and scared my voice sounded in the darkness. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound had been. With shaking hands, I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously approached the door. Every instinct screamed at me to stay inside, to hide until dawn. But I had to know. I threw open the door and shone the flashlight into the night. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating trees and shadows, until it fell upon a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was a man. Tall, gaunt, with a wild, unkempt beard and eyes that reflected the light like an animal's. With a jolt of horror, I realized he looked just like the man from the final photograph. "What do you want?" I demanded, trying and failing to keep the tremor out of my voice. The man didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. And then, slowly, his lips curled into a smile that was anything but friendly. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my mind racing. Who was he? What did he want? I spent the rest of the night huddled in my bed, jumping at every sound, the flashlight clutched in my sweaty hand like a talisman. As the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I made a decision. I was leaving. This trip, this place, it wasn't worth it. I packed up as quickly as I could, constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting to see the gaunt man watching me from the tree line. It wasn't until I was almost finished that I noticed it. There, scratched into the dirt near where I'd had my fire, was a single word. Stay. I didn't need any more encouragement to leave. I finished loading the RV in record time and peeled out of the campsite, gravel spraying behind me. As I navigated the twisting road out of the forest, my eyes constantly darted to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man chasing after me. It wasn't until I reached the main highway that I finally began to relax. The bright sunshine and the sight of other cars, other people, helped to push back the lingering dread that had taken root in my chest. I drove for hours, putting as much distance between myself and the whispering woods as I could. Eventually, I had to stop for gas. I pulled into a small town service station, the kind of place that seems frozen in time. As I filled up the RV, an old man approached me. He introduced himself as Earl and asked where I was coming from. When I mentioned Shadowbrook and the Whispering Woods, his weathered face grew serious. "You shouldn't have gone there," he said, his voice low. "That place has a dark history." Over cups of bitter coffee in the station's small diner, Earl told me a story that made my blood run cold. The cabin I'd found had once belonged to the Blackwood family. Thomas, his wife Eleanor, and their 2 children, Abigail and Samuel. They'd been one of the original settling families in the area, living off the land and keeping to themselves. But something had happened to them. Something terrible. Earl wasn't clear on the details. Time had a way of muddying the truth. But he spoke of madness, of dark rituals in the woods, of a hunger that couldn't be satisfied. The official story was that the family had succumbed to disease or starvation during a particularly harsh winter. But the locals knew better. "They say the forest took them," Earl said, his rheumy eyes distant. "Swallowed them up and twisted them into something else. Something that ain't quite human anymore." I listened, a cold knot forming in the pit of my stomach. Earl went on to tell me about the disappearances that had plagued the area over the years. Hikers, campers, even a few locals, all vanishing without a trace in or around the Whispering Woods. "The forest calls to some people," Earl said, "draws them in, and once it gets its hooks in you, it doesn't let go easy." I left the gas station feeling shaken to my core. Earl's stories had given form to the nameless dread I'd felt in the woods, but they'd also left me with more questions than answers. Part of me wanted to dismiss it all as local superstition, the kind of spooky stories every small town has. But I couldn't shake the memory of the gaunt man's eyes, of the words scratched into the dirt outside my RV. I drove home in a daze, my mind replaying every moment of my time in the Whispering Woods. By the time I reached my apartment, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I told myself that all I needed was a good night's sleep in my own bed, surrounded by the comforting noise of the city. Everything would look different in the morning, but sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the Blackwood family's faces from those old photographs. I heard the crunch of footsteps outside my RV. I felt the oppressive silence of the forest pressing down on me. When I finally did fall asleep, my dreams were vivid and terrifying. I was back in the woods, running from something I couldn't see. The trees reached out to grab me, their branches tearing at my clothes and skin. I could hear voices on the wind, whispers that spoke of ancient hunger and patient malevolence. And always, just behind me, were footsteps, slow, steady, inexorable. I woke up screaming, tangled in my sweat-soaked sheets. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. The shadows in the corners of my room seemed to move, and I could have sworn I caught a whiff of pine and decay. The next few weeks were a struggle. I tried to go back to my normal routine, but nothing felt right. The city, which had once been my home, now felt confining. The noise and the crowds that I'd always taken for granted now set my teeth on edge. I found myself longing for the quiet of the forest, even as the memory of it filled me with dread. I couldn't focus at work. My mind kept wandering back to the whispering woods, to the cabin, to the gaunt man with his animal eyes. I started researching the area's history, digging into old newspaper archives and local folklore. What I found only deepened the mystery. The Blackwood family wasn't the only one to vanish in those woods. Over the decades, there had been dozens of disappearances. Some were written off as accidents or runaways, but others defied explanation. And always, there were whispers of something in the forest. Something old and hungry. I became obsessed. My apartment walls became covered with maps, newspaper clippings, and hastily scribbled notes. I spent hours on online forums dedicated to unsolved mysteries and paranormal encounters, sharing my story and seeking others who might have had similar experiences. That's how I met Lily Chen. She reached out to me after reading my account on one of the forums. Lily was a graduate student in anthropology, specializing in folklore and rural American myths. She had been researching the Whispering Woods and the surrounding area for her thesis. We met for coffee, and I found myself pouring out the whole story to her. To my relief, Lily didn't think I was crazy. In fact, she had her own theories about what was happening in the Whispering Woods. There are places in this world, she told me, her dark eyes intense, where the veil between realities is thin. Places where old magic still lingers. I think the Whispering Woods might be one of those places. Lily shared her research with me. She had collected dozens of stories from the area, spanning back over a century. Tales of strange lights in the woods, of people going in and coming out changed, if they came out at all. She spoke of ancient Native American legends about a hungry spirit that lived in the forest, and of early settler accounts of a shadow that walks like a man. As fantastic as it all sounded, it resonated with what I had experienced. It gave shape to the formless dread that had followed me out of the woods. And more than that, it offered the possibility of answers. Lily proposed that we go back to the Whispering Woods. She wanted to conduct a proper investigation, to document the phenomena and perhaps uncover the truth behind the legends. Part of me recoiled at the idea of returning to that place. But a larger part, the part that had always yearned for adventure and answers, leapt at the chance. We spent weeks planning the trip. We pored over maps, plotting out the locations of known disappearances and sightings. We gathered equipment, cameras, audio recorders, EMF detectors, and more. Lily even reached out to some of her colleagues in the paranormal research field, and soon our two-person expedition had grown to include a psychic medium named Madame Zora and a grizzled ex-marine turned cryptozoologist who went by the name Grizzly. As our departure date approached, my dreams became more vivid and unsettling. I saw the Blackwood family, their flesh rotting off their bones, beckoning me deeper into the woods. I heard whispers in a language I didn't understand but somehow knew was ancient and full of malice. And always, there was the gaunt man with his animal eyes, watching and waiting. The night before we left, I had the most terrifying dream yet. I was back in the cabin, but it was different. The decay was gone, replaced by a pristine interior that looked like it had been frozen in time. The Blackwood family sat around the table, their eyes hollow and black. They turned to look at me in unison, their mouths opening impossibly wide. And from those gaping maws came a sound, not a scream, not a roar, but a rustling whisper like wind through dead leaves. It spoke a single word, over and over. Return. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. For a moment I considered calling the whole thing off, but I knew I couldn't. Whatever was happening in the Whispering Woods, whatever had happened to me, I needed answers. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that those answers were waiting for me in the forest. As I packed my bags and prepared to meet the others, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into something far beyond my understanding. The dream lingered in my mind, its whispered command echoing in my thoughts. Return. Our team gathered early the next morning. Lily was practically vibrating with excitement, her eyes bright with the prospect of discovery. Madame Zora, a small, wiry woman with wild gray hair and eyes that seemed to look through you rather than at you, kept muttering under her breath and fingering a collection of talismans around her neck. Grizzly, true to his name, was a bear of a man with a bushy beard and hands like meat hooks. He loaded our gear into the van with practiced efficiency, checking and double-checking our supplies. The drive to the Whispering Woods was tense. I found myself gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, my eyes constantly darting to the rearview mirror, as if expecting to see the gaunt man following us. As we neared our destination, the atmosphere in the van changed. Conversations died away, replaced by an expectant silence. We set up base camp at the same clearing where I had stayed before. As soon as we entered the woods, Madame Zora became agitated. She paced the perimeter of our camp, muttering incantations and scattering herbs. "This place," she said, her accent thick with tension. "It hungers. It watches. We must be careful." Grizzly set up our equipment with military precision. Motion-activated cameras, audio recorders, night vision goggles. Lily began taking samples of soil and vegetation, meticulously cataloging everything. I found myself drawn to the path that led to the old cabin, my feet moving almost of their own accord. "I'll scout ahead," I called to the others, ignoring their protests. I knew I shouldn't go alone, but something was pulling me forward. The forest seemed to close in around me as I walked, the trees looming larger, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of leaves under my feet and the pounding of my own heart. The cabin looked exactly as I remembered it, a dilapidated relic lost in time. But as I approached, something changed. For a moment, just a moment, I saw it as it must have been when the Blackwoods lived there. Paint fresh and bright, smoke curling from the chimney, the sounds of a family going about their day drifting through the open windows. Then I blinked, and it was a ruin once more. I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking ominously under my weight. The stack of photographs was still there on the table, untouched since my last visit. But now there was something else, a leather-bound book, its cover etched with strange symbols. My hand reached for it almost involuntarily. As my fingers brushed the cover, a jolt of energy surged through me. Images flashed through my mind, the Blackwood family, their faces twisted in terror and ecstasy, dark shapes moving through the trees, a hunger vast and ancient stirring in the heart of the forest. I heard whispers, countless voices speaking as one. "You have returned. You are ours now." I don't know how long I stood there, lost in that vision. I came back to myself with a start, the book clutched to my chest. Outside, I could hear the others calling my name, their voices tinged with panic. I stumbled out of the cabin, my mind reeling. The next few days passed in a blur of increasing tension and unexplainable events. Our equipment malfunctioned constantly, batteries draining for no reason, recordings filled with static and whispers. Madame Zora grew more agitated by the hour, muttering about malevolent spirits and ancient evils. Grizzly, for all his skepticism, grew jumpy, his hand constantly straying to the hunting knife at his belt. Lily threw herself into her research with a fervor that bordered on obsession. She pored over the book I'd found, working to decipher its cryptic text. "It's a record," she told us, her eyes fever-bright with lack of sleep. "A record of the forest, of the thing that lives here. The Blackwoods didn't disappear. They became part of it. willingly. As the days wore on, the forest seemed to press in closer. We began to see things out of the corner of our eyes, flitting shadows, pale faces peering from behind trees. At night, we huddled around our campfire, jumping at every snapping twig and rustle of leaves. Sleep, when it came, was filled with nightmares of pursuit and consumption. On our 5th night in the woods, everything came to a head. We were woken by Madame Zora's screams. She was standing at the edge of our camp, pointing into the darkness with a shaking hand. There, just beyond the reach of our flashlights, stood the gaunt man. But he wasn't alone. Behind him were shapes, dozens of them, vaguely human, but wrong somehow, their proportions distorted, their movements jerky and unnatural. "Run!" Grizzly bellowed, grabbing what gear he could. We fled into the night, the sounds of pursuit close behind us. The forest seemed to come alive around us, branches whipping at our faces, roots rising to trip our feet. I could hear whispers on the wind, calling my name, promising power and knowledge if only I would stop, turn around, embrace the hunger. I don't know how long we ran, or how we found our way out of the woods. The night passed in a nightmarish blur of terror and exhaustion. When we finally broke free of the tree line, stumbling onto the main road as the first light of dawn touched the sky, we were down to just 3. Madame Zora was gone, lost somewhere in the dark heart of the forest. We never spoke about what happened that night, not really. Grizzly left as soon as we reached civilization, muttering about heading somewhere far away, somewhere with no trees. Lily threw herself back into her research, determined to make sense of what we'd experienced. She talks about going back someday, about finishing what we started. I pray she never does. As for me, I've tried to put it all behind me. I moved to the city, as far from any forest as I could get. But at night, I still dream of the Whispering Woods. I see the Blackwood family, their faces both familiar and terribly alien, beckoning me to join them. I hear the whispers, promising that one day I'll return. And sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I catch a glimpse of something in my eyes. A hunger, vast and patient, waiting to be fed. The Whispering Woods taught me a harsh truth. There are places in this world where the familiar rules don't apply, where ancient hungers still lurk in the shadows. And once you've glimpsed what lies beyond the veil, you can never truly look away. The forest is patient. It can wait. And someday, I fear, I will answer its call to return. October 12th, 1999. That's when it all began. The day that changed everything I thought I knew about the world. My name is Finn Barlow, and I'm a carpenter by trade. I've always been good with my hands, able to see the potential in a piece of wood that others might overlook. It's a skill that's served me well over the years, allowing me to build a decent life for myself. But on that crisp autumn day, as I drove my battered pickup truck along winding mountain roads, I had no idea that I was heading towards something that would shatter my understanding of reality. The job seemed straightforward enough. An old house tucked away in the White Mountains of New Hampshire needed extensive renovation work before winter set in. The pay was good, better than usual for this kind of gig, which should have been my first warning sign. But I was too focused on the opportunity to question it. The chance to work in solitude, surrounded by nature, was appealing. I've always been more comfortable with the quiet company of tools and timber than with the chaos of city life. As I navigated the narrow, twisting roads that led deeper into the mountains, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease creeping over me. The forests here were old, the trees towering sentinels that seemed to watch my progress with ancient, knowing eyes. Shadows deepened quickly as the sun dipped behind the peaks, and I found myself unconsciously pressing the accelerator, eager to reach my destination before full dark. The locals I'd encountered in the last town before the wilderness took over had been odd. Friendly enough on the surface, but there was a wariness in their eyes when I mentioned where I was headed. One old-timer at the general store, his face weathered like old leather, had fixed me with a hard stare. "You be careful up there, son," he'd said, his voice low and gravelly. "Folks have been known to vanish in those parts. Been happening for centuries, some say." I'd laughed it off at the time, chalking it up to small-town superstition. But now, as the shadows lengthened and the forest pressed in around me, those words took on a more ominous tone. Finally, after what felt like hours of driving, I spotted the turnoff. A barely visible dirt road, more of a trail really, snaking off into the gloom. My headlights caught the reflective surface of a battered mailbox, the numbers matching those I'd been given. This was it. The house, when I finally laid eyes on it, was a sorry sight. 2 stories of weathered clapboard siding, windows dark and lifeless, a sagging porch that looked ready to collapse at any moment. It hunched there in a small clearing, as if trying to shrink away from the encroaching forest. But to my carpenter's eye, I could see the bones of something beautiful beneath the neglect. With some hard work and skill, this place could be transformed. I parked my truck and climbed out, stretching muscles stiff from the long drive. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and decaying leaves. As I breathed deeply, savoring the clean mountain air, a twig snapped somewhere in the surrounding woods. I whipped my head around, suddenly alert, but saw nothing but deepening shadows among the trees. Shaking off the momentary unease, I set about unloading my gear. Tools, supplies, enough food to last me a couple of weeks at least. The owner had assured me the place had running water and a generator for electricity, but I'd learned long ago to be prepared for anything on remote jobs like this. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every so often I'd pause, certain I'd caught a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. But each time I looked directly, there was nothing there. Just trees and shadows, growing darker by the minute. "Get a grip, Finn," I muttered to myself, hefting my toolbox. "You're letting those old stories get to you." But even as I climbed the creaking steps and unlocked the front door, I couldn't quite convince myself that everything was as it should be. Something about this place, about these mountains, felt wrong. Off-kilter in a way I couldn't quite put my finger on. If I'd known then what I know now, I would have turned around, gotten back in my truck, and driven until this godforsaken place was nothing but a speck in my rearview mirror. But I didn't know. So I stepped across the threshold, into the musty darkness of the old house, and unknowingly set in motion a chain of events that would change my life forever. The interior of the house was a time capsule, layers of history visible in the peeling wallpaper and worn floorboards. Dust motes danced in the beam of my flashlight as I made my way through the rooms, taking stock of the work ahead. It was extensive, but nothing I couldn't handle, or so I thought. I spent that first night on a camping cot in what would eventually become the living room, surrounded by my tools and the creaking sounds of the old house settling. Sleep came fitfully, punctuated by strange dreams of moving shadows and glowing eyes watching me from the darkness. Morning brought a semblance of normalcy. Sunlight streamed through the grimy windows, transforming the house from a den of shadows into a more benign, if dilapidated structure. I set to work with enthusiasm, tearing out rotted boards and shoring up weak spots in the foundation. The days began to blur together, each one a rhythm of physical labor that left me exhausted but satisfied. I made good progress, and for a while, I managed to convince myself that my unease that first night had been nothing more than the product of an overactive imagination. But as the first week drew to a close, things began to change. It started small, almost imperceptible. Tools that weren't quite where I'd left them. The sensation of eyes on the back of my neck when I worked outside. And the dreams. They grew more vivid, more terrifying. I'd wake in a cold sweat, the echo of an inhuman howl ringing in my ears. Then came the morning I found the tracks. I'd stepped outside at dawn, stretching in the cool mountain air, when something caught my eye. There, in a patch of soft earth near the tree line, was a series of prints unlike anything I'd ever seen. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own foot, with 5 long toes ending in deep claw marks. The shape was almost human, but distorted, wrong in a way that sent a chill down my spine. I tried to rationalize it. Some local playing a prank on the new guy, maybe. Or a bear, though I knew deep down that no bear made tracks like these. As I stood there, staring at those impossible prints, the feeling of being watched intensified. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I had the overwhelming urge to run, to get in my truck and never look back. But I didn't. Whether it was stubbornness, curiosity, or simply the need for the paycheck, I stayed. And in doing so, I set myself on a collision course with something ancient and terrifying. Something that would shatter my understanding of the world and leave me forever changed. The days that followed the discovery of those tracks were filled with a growing sense of dread. I tried to focus on my work, pushing myself harder than ever in an attempt to finish the job quickly and get out of there. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting. It was about a week after I'd found the tracks that things came to a head. I'd been working late into the evening, trying to finish up some repairs in the kitchen. The rhythmic sound of my hammer striking nails had become almost meditative, allowing me to momentarily forget my fears. Then I heard it. A heavy thud against the side of the house, like something large had collided with the outer wall. The hammer slipped from my suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor. For a long moment, I stood frozen, straining my ears for any further sound. Silence. With trembling hands, I reached for the flashlight I kept nearby. Part of me wanted to barricade myself inside, to hide until dawn and then flee this godforsaken place. But a larger part, driven by a mix of curiosity and stubborn pride, propelled me towards the door. The night air was crisp and still as I stepped onto the porch. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, dancing over the overgrown yard and the looming wall of trees beyond. At first, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Then a movement caught my eye. There, at the edge of the woods, about 20 feet from where I stood, was a form that defied explanation. It was crouched low, a massive, twisted shape that my mind struggled to comprehend. As my light fell upon it, the creature seemed to flinch, shrinking back from the beam. My heart was hammering so loudly in my chest that I was sure the thing could hear it. Slowly, with a fluid grace that belied its size, the creature rose to its full height. It had to be at least 7 feet tall, possibly more. Its body was covered in coarse, gray fur, all lean muscle and sinew. But it was the eyes that truly chilled me to my core. They were huge, reflecting my flashlight beam with an eerie amber glow. But it wasn't just the size or the color that was unsettling. There was an intelligence in those eyes, a cold, calculating awareness that spoke of something far more than a simple animal. And behind that intelligence, I sensed something else. Malice. Hunger. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, we stood there, locked in a silent standoff. Then, with a speed that seemed impossible for its size, the creature moved. It let out a blood-curdling howl that shook me to my very soul, a sound that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. And then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone, vanishing into the darkness of the forest. I stumbled back inside, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. With shaking hands, I barricaded the door, piling furniture against it in a desperate bid for some sense of security. Sleep was out of the question. I spent the night huddled in a corner, my back to the wall, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. When morning finally came, I half expected to find that it had all been some vivid nightmare brought on by isolation and an overactive imagination. But the furniture was still piled against the door. And outside, I found more tracks, deeper this time, as if the creature had been pacing around the house all night. But it was the other discovery that finally broke me. Near the edge of the woods, I found the remains of a deer, or rather, half of a deer. The carcass had been torn apart with brutal force, and the stench of death hung heavy in the air. That was it. I couldn't stay here any longer. Whatever was out there, whatever I'd seen, it was real, and it was dangerous. I threw my things haphazardly into my truck, not even bothering to pack properly. As I pulled away from the house, I couldn't help but glance in my rearview mirror. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw something large and dark move between the trees, watching me leave. I didn't look back again. The drive back to civilization was a blur. I pushed my old truck to its limits, half expecting at any moment to see that twisted form loping after me on the road. It wasn't until I was back in town, surrounded by the comforting sounds of normal, everyday life, that I began to relax. But the relaxation was short-lived. As the immediate fear faded, questions began to crowd my mind. What had I seen? What was that thing? And most pressingly, what should I do about it? I wrestled with the idea of going to the authorities. But what would I say? That I'd seen some kind of monster in the woods? They'd think I was crazy, or worse, that I was trying to cover up some kind of crime. No, going to the police wasn't an option. For weeks, I tried to put it behind me. I took on small jobs around town, threw myself into mundane tasks, anything to keep my mind occupied. But I couldn't shake the memory of those glowing eyes, that inhuman howl. It was about a month after my experience in the mountains that I found myself in a bar on the outskirts of town. I wasn't much of a drinker usually, but that night I was seeking the numbing embrace of alcohol to quiet my thoughts. As I nursed my beer, my attention was caught by a conversation at a nearby table. Two men were discussing a recent news story. My blood ran cold as I listened. Another one gone missing up in the Whites, one man was saying, shaking his head sadly. Third one this year. Damn shame, his companion replied. They're saying it was near that old Carlson place. You know, the one that's been abandoned for years. I felt the color drain from my face. The Carlson place. That was the house I'd been working on. With trembling hands, I pulled out my phone and searched for local news. Sure enough, there it was. A hiker had gone missing in the White Mountains, last seen in an area uncomfortably close to where I'd been working. The article mentioned that search teams had found some unidentified animal tracks in the area. I knew what had made those tracks. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I'd known something was out there, something dangerous, and I'd run away. How many people had disappeared since then? How many lives had been lost because I'd been too scared to speak up? The guilt was overwhelming. I should have done something, said something. But even as I thought it, I knew that no one would have believed me. They'd have dismissed me as a drunk or a madman, just like I would have, before I'd seen it with my own eyes. As I sat there, wrestling with my conscience, my phone buzzed. A text message from a number I didn't recognize. The contents made my heart skip a beat. Finn, it's Egan. We need to talk about the Carlson job. Call me. Egan. My old boss. The one who'd sent me up to that house in the first place. With shaking fingers, I dialed the number. Egan's gruff voice answered on the second ring. Finn, he said, his tone grave. I think you and I need to have a conversation about what really happened up there. The meeting with Egan was set for the next day, at a quiet diner on the edge of town. I arrived early, my nerves jangling, half expecting Egan to show up with the police in tow. But when he walked in, he was alone, looking older and more haggard than I remembered. We ordered coffee, more for something to do with our hands than out of any real desire for caffeine. For a long moment, we sat in silence, each waiting for the other to speak first. Finally, Egan sighed heavily. I owe you an apology, Finn, he said, his voice low. I should have warned you before I sent you up there. But I figured, hell, I don't know what I figured. That maybe it was all just stories, old wives' tales. I felt a surge of anger. You knew, I said, my voice tight. You knew there was something up there and you sent me in blind. Egan nodded, his eyes downcast. I knew the stories, been hearing them all my life. But stories are just stories, right? At least that's what I told myself. Needed that job done, and you're the best I've got. Damn near got you killed. I wanted to be furious with him, but the guilt in his eyes was genuine. And if I was honest with myself, I probably wouldn't have believed him if he'd told me the truth beforehand. What is it? I asked, leaning in close. That thing I saw. What the hell was it? Egan glanced around, as if checking for eavesdroppers before answering. The old-timers have a name for them. Skinwalkers, they call them. Not quite human, not quite animal. Something in between. Been here longer than us, they say. And they're hungry. Always hungry. I felt a chill run down my spine at his words. Why doesn't anyone do anything? People are dying up there. Egan shook his head sadly. You think no one's tried? Over the years, there have been hunting parties, expeditions. They all end the same way. Either the hunters come back empty-handed, or they don't come back at all. We lapsed into silence, each lost in our own thoughts. The gravity of the situation weighed heavily on me. There was something out there, something dangerous, and it seemed like there was nothing we could do about it. But as I sat there, staring into my cooling coffee, a resolve began to form in my mind. I couldn't just walk away from this, not again. I'd run once and people had died. I couldn't live with myself if I didn't at least try to do something. I'm going back, I said, the words surprising me even as they left my mouth. Egan's head snapped up, his eyes wide with alarm. Are you out of your mind? Didn't you hear a word I said? It's suicide. Maybe, I admitted. But I can't just sit here and do nothing. Not when I know what's out there. Not when people are dying. For a long moment, Egan stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then slowly, he nodded. You're either the bravest man I've ever met, or the craziest, he said. But if you're set on this, well, I reckon I owe you. I'm coming with you. I started to protest, but he held up a hand to silence me. I sent you up there once without knowing the full story. I'm not making that mistake again. Besides, he added with a grim smile, 2 pairs of eyes are better than 1 when you're hunting monsters. And so, with a mixture of determination and fear, we began to plan our return to the White Mountains. Little did we know, we were about to embark on a journey that would test us to our very limits and force us to confront horrors beyond our wildest nightmares. The drive back up to the mountains was tense, to say the least. Egan and I had spent the past week preparing, gathering supplies and weapons. We had hunting rifles, silver bullets. At Egan's insistence, apparently silver was supposed to be effective against skinwalkers, and enough provisions to last us a couple of weeks. As we wound our way up the familiar mountain roads, I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread settling over me. The forest seemed darker, more menacing than I remembered. Every shadow held the potential for danger. Every rustle in the undergrowth sent my heart racing. We arrived at the old Carlson place just as the sun was beginning to set. The house looked even more dilapidated than when I'd left it, as if the very land was trying to reclaim it. We set up camp in what had once been the living room, boarding up the windows and setting up a series of alarms around the perimeter. That first night was the hardest. Every creak of the old house, every whisper of wind through the trees had us on edge. We took turns keeping watch, our rifles close at hand. But nothing came. Days passed, blending into one another. We patrolled the area during the day, looking for signs of the creatures. At night, we huddled in the house, waiting, watching. The tension was unbearable. It was on the 5th night that everything changed. I was on watch, Egan sleeping fitfully nearby when I heard it. A low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. I nudged Egan awake, pressing a finger to my lips for silence. We moved to the windows, peering out into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing. Then, a movement caught my eye. Something large was moving at the edge of the clearing, its form indistinct in the gloom. Egan must have seen it too, because I felt him tense beside me. Slowly, carefully, we raised our rifles. The creature moved again, and this time I caught a glimpse of glowing amber eyes. My heart leaped into my throat. It was the same creature I'd seen before. What happened next was a blur of chaos and terror. The creature charged, moving with impossible speed. We opened fire, the sound of gunshots shattering the night. I saw the creature stumble, heard it roar in pain and fury. But it kept coming. It crashed through the boarded-up window in a shower of glass and splintered wood. I caught a glimpse of matted fur, of razor-sharp claws, of those terrifying eyes blazing with hunger and rage. Egan and I fell back, still firing. The creature's movements became erratic, jerky. Our bullets were having an effect, but it wasn't going down. In desperation, I grabbed for the silver knife we'd brought as a last resort. The creature lunged at Egan, its massive form bowling him over. I saw claws flash, heard Egan's scream of pain. Without thinking, I threw myself at the beast, driving the silver knife deep into its side. The effect was instantaneous. The creature let out a howl of agony, a sound so piercing it felt like it might shatter my eardrums. It thrashed wildly, throwing me off. I hit the wall hard, my vision blurring. Through the haze, I saw the creature stagger, black ichor oozing from its wounds. It fixed me with one last hate-filled glare, then turned and crashed back out through the broken window, disappearing into the night. For a long moment, all I could hear was my own ragged breathing and Egan's pained groans. We were alive, but barely. Egan's arm was badly mauled, and I was pretty sure I had a concussion. As the adrenaline began to fade, the full weight of what had just happened hit me. We'd faced the creature, wounded it, but we hadn't killed it. And now it knew we were here, knew we were a threat. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The aftermath of our encounter was a haze of pain and fear. I patched up Egan as best I could, using our limited first aid supplies. His arm was a mess of deep gashes, but the bleeding had slowed. We were both in bad shape, but alive. For now. As dawn broke, casting long shadows across the ruined living room, we took stock of our situation. Our supplies were scattered, many of our defenses destroyed. We were injured, exhausted, and now we knew for certain. The creature was out there, and it was far more dangerous than we'd imagined. "We need help," Egan grunted, wincing as he tried to move his injured arm. "We can't do this alone." I nodded grimly. He was right, of course. But who could we possibly turn to? The authorities wouldn't believe us, and even if they did, they weren't equipped to handle something like this. That's when we heard it. A soft whistle from outside. Egan and I exchanged alarmed glances. Had the creature returned? But no, this sound was distinctly human. Cautiously, rifle at the ready, I approached the shattered window. What I saw made me blink in disbelief. There, standing at the edge of the clearing, was a man. Tall, lean, with the weathered features of someone who'd spent a lifetime in these mountains. He was dressed in what looked like a mix of modern outdoor gear and traditional Native American clothing. And he was armed. I could see the gleam of a high-powered rifle slung across his back. The stranger raised his hand slowly, showing he meant no harm. "Looks like you boys could use a hand," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the clearing. Egan and I exchanged glances. After a moment's hesitation, I called back. "Who are you?" "Name's Nathaniel. the man replied. "I've been tracking that skinwalker you tangled with. Heard the commotion last night. Figured I'd check it out." My mind raced. This man knew about the skinwalkers. He'd been tracking the creature. Could he be an ally? Cautiously, we invited Nathaniel inside. As he stepped through the ruined doorway, I couldn't help but notice the way his eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail. This was a man who knew how to survive in dangerous situations. "You're lucky to be alive," Nathaniel said, examining our wounds with a practiced eye. "Not many folks survive a direct encounter with a skinwalker." As he helped us properly dress our injuries, Nathaniel explained his story. He was a member of a local Native American tribe, one that had been dealing with the skinwalker threat for generations. They were the protectors, he said, keeping the ancient evil at bay and preventing it from preying on unsuspecting outsiders. But in recent years, it's gotten harder, Nathaniel admitted, his face grim. More people coming into the mountains, more potential victims, and the skinwalkers. They're getting bolder. We spent the rest of the day exchanging information. Nathaniel was a wealth of knowledge about the skinwalkers, their habits, their weaknesses, the best ways to fight them. Silver was indeed effective, as were certain herbs and rituals passed down through his tribe. As night fell, we prepared for another potential attack. But Nathaniel assured us that the skinwalker we'd wounded would be licking its wounds, at least for tonight. "But it'll be back," he warned. "And it won't be alone. These things, they hold grudges, and they're smart, far smarter than any normal animal." Over the next few days, Nathaniel taught us everything he could. We learned to move silently through the forest, to spot the subtle signs of skinwalker activity. We practiced with the weapons Nathaniel had brought, not just guns and knives, but also more esoteric tools. Pouches of sacred herbs that burned the creature's flesh, amulets that could disrupt their shape-shifting abilities. All the while, we could feel the tension building. The forest around us seemed to grow quieter, as if holding its breath. The skinwalkers were out there watching, waiting for their moment to strike. It came on the 5th night after Nathaniel's arrival. We were gathered around a small fire, going over our plans one last time, when we heard it. A chorus of howls, echoing through the mountains. But these weren't the howls of wolves. They were deeper, more guttural, with an almost human quality that sent chills down my spine. "They're coming," Nathaniel said, his voice tight with tension. "And there's more than one." We doused the fire and took up our positions. The night seemed to press in around us, the darkness almost palpable. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then they came. They burst from the tree line like living shadows, all teeth and claws and glowing eyes. I caught glimpses of twisted, half-human forms before the night erupted into chaos. Gunshots rang out, the flash of muzzles briefly illuminating the scene. I saw one of the creatures stumble as Egan's shot found its mark, but it kept coming. These things were tough, far tougher than any natural animal. I fired my own weapon, the silver bullets leaving trails of acrid smoke in their wake. One of the skinwalkers let out a shriek of pain as the blessed metal tore into its flesh. But for every one we wounded, it seemed like 2 more took its place. Nathaniel was a whirlwind of motion, his movements fluid and precise. He wielded an ancient-looking blade that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, and wherever it struck, the skinwalkers recoiled in agony. But we were outnumbered, and the skinwalkers were driven by a primal hunger and rage that seemed to give them superhuman strength. Slowly but surely, they began to push us back towards the house. Just when it seemed like we might be overwhelmed, Nathaniel shouted something in a language I didn't understand. He threw a handful of powder into the air, and suddenly the clearing was filled with a blinding light. The skinwalkers howled in pain and confusion, their sensitive eyes unable to cope with the sudden illumination. It was the opening we needed. We pressed our advantage, driving the creatures back. Silver bullets found their marks. Blessed blades bit deep. One by one, the skinwalkers began to fall. The battle seemed to last for hours, though it was probably only minutes. By the time it was over, the ground was littered with the twisted bodies of the fallen skinwalkers. Those that could still move had retreated into the forest, leaving behind only the stench of blood and the echoes of their inhuman cries. We were battered, bleeding, but alive. As the adrenaline began to fade, I looked around at my companions. Egan was leaning heavily against a tree, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Nathaniel stood tall, his blade dripping with dark ichor, his eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of renewed threat. And me? I felt different, changed. The world I'd known, the reality I'd understood had been shattered, but in its place, a new understanding was forming. These creatures, these skinwalkers, they were real. They were a threat, and we had fought them. As dawn began to break, casting long shadows across the blood-soaked clearing, Nathaniel turned to us. "It's not over," he said, his voice grave. "We've won a battle, but the war? It's just beginning." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words. I knew then that I couldn't go back to my old life. Not now, not after what I'd seen and done. This was my fight now. Our fight. The skinwalkers were still out there in the deep, dark places of the world, and as long as they threatened innocent lives, we would be there to stand against them. As we began to clean up and treat our wounds, I couldn't help but cast one last glance at the forest. For a moment, I thought I saw a pair of glowing eyes watching us from the shadows. But then they were gone, leaving me to wonder if it had been real or just a trick of the light. One thing was certain. Our lives would never be the same again. The shadows of White Mountain had changed us forever, setting us on a path we could never have imagined. And somewhere out there in the darkness, the skinwalkers were waiting, biding their time until our next encounter.